Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today along with Mustapha Price, the show's producer, and this is episode 138, where we're going to be talking about the importance of future planning. Now, for most indie devs working on a game, it's probably safe to say that their number one priority is focusing on the game and wherever they are in the development cycle, and understandably so. But while it's good to be focused and driven to complete tasks at hand, it's also important to dedicate some of that time to reflect and plan ahead. That's why today, Mustapha and I are going to be discussing the importance of evaluation, projection, and execution as it relates to us directly and indie devs too, so you can be better positioned not only to hit your goals, but potentially exceed them and be ready for anything that gets thrown in your way. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, how's it going? And we're back. And like I said, I have Mustapha here. Mustapha, how's it going, buddy?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day outside. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing great as well. And as Mustapha said at the time of this recording, it is like, what is it? We're just 1 week into November, and it's like 73 out. It feels like summer. It's really weird. I'm not gonna lie. We're based in northeastern United States, and 73 is not normal for right now.
Yeah, I mean, given the 6 to 7 nor'easters that we're due for fairly soon, I'll take a freebie if I can get it.
Yeah. So after this, I'll be going outside, and not now, but I'll probably be throwing on shorts, and then give it a day or two, and I'll be in layers. So
yeah.
But anyways, we're not talking about the weather today, at least anymore. We are talking about the future, or not necessarily we are talking about the future, actually, like planning for the future, specifically the importance of future planning. And the reason why we thought this would be a good thing to talk about is, well, I mean, first of all, like, why is planning for the future important? Like, what's so important about thinking forward and what you plan on doing? Because I mean, let's face it, a lot of times, with us, what we do is a little bit different than a majority of you listening to the show, as far as like what you're doing. Okay, what else do I need to plan for so much? I'm making a game, right? Well, there's a lot, and there's a lot more to think about that than just simply the, even the marketing side of things. There's a lot of things to plan for. So, Mustapha, I want to have your response. So what would you say is important about, future planning and where you as, a company is going and stuff, or even you personally? Like, what is the importance of, looking ahead and planning for the future?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think, for myself, I can definitely speak to this from a couple of different angles, both with my game dev team, Featherfellow Games. We still kind of have some projects in the works, and then also.
Oh, and real quick, mention what is Featherfellow Games, like, so people really clearly know specifically what you're doing with your company.
Sure. So Featherfellow Games is a 3-man game dev group based out of New Hampshire. We primarily, for the time being, have a focus in party games, and so. We've got a few titles that we're kind of in the early stages of. So yeah, hopefully more news on that soon. But yeah, I think from that angle, working independently, even Andrew, our work with Indie Game Movement, I think this year especially has been such a clear teacher to everyone about the importance of future planning. If for no other reason than the fact that so many of us had to make fairly dramatic changes to our day-to-day workflow kind of on the fly. And I think we also kind of saw the consequences of that in a lot of ways, even for large scale companies, overseas and otherwise.
Right.
And so to kind of elaborate, to dig into that further, I think future planning kind of takes many different forms. It involves having multiple plans that complement, different workflows and different styles of work. I think it can be fairly enlightening to people kind of taking inventory of their own resources as a team, as an individual, or otherwise. So yeah, I would say future planning is perhaps the single most important thing you can do to either create or maintain momentum in any sort of project-based or business structure. So, I'm sorry.
No, that's right. I just want to add as a one point too, because like in terms of how I view it too, it's always nice because what it does is it gives you a basic guide, right? So it's not to say that anything that you plan for the future, is going to go right according to plan. It never does, right? You mentioned the pandemic, right? But I think with having a plan in place, planning for the future, when things get out of hand, and which regardless if there's a pandemic or not, they will at some point. You can then, when things go crazy, you can at least look back to that plan and still say, I have this guide, I have this direction. And then it makes it easier, like you said, it allows for that momentum to continue. Because without one, and when things get crazy, it can be very difficult and overwhelming and everything to stay on task, to stay on point and move forward with that momentum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even in the most basic of terms, a lot of us have probably seen firsthand the way places that already had an existing remote work structure, for instance, were able to so easily transition,
right.
Even during the quarantine times. And that's just an example. Like that is, if you have to change the way you're working in games, I'm assuming it's probably more common for people to have to change what they're working on. And I think that's something that's really important about future planning as well, and about designing kind of a structured workflow for yourself, is to avoid kind of being caught off guard if you have to pivot in a different direction on a project. Right. If whatever your kind of primary focus is at the moment needs to be shifted elsewhere. And I guess to kind of dig a little bit more into the weeds of that, I would kind of like to address what I think is one of the most important tools of future planning, which is an understanding of scope. For anyone who doesn't know, in the context of game design specifically, scope is kind of an awareness of the parameters under which you're kind of designing a project. It involves having an understanding of time, of manpower, of people's individual skill sets, and of course, what kind of your overall timeline would be for a project. So those are the things that you're mainly wanting to take into consideration as you're starting to plan future projects, as you're starting to set those specific goals, because oftentimes things that kind of leave people caught off guard tend to be a result of being overly ambitious. So, for instance, if you are, and I'm sure this is probably true of a lot of our audience, if you are someone who wants to design indie games and is just starting out, and you are working by yourself on a project, and perhaps it's not at the point yet where developing games is your day job. So maybe you've got 40 hours a week for work, and then maybe a significant other or family, friends, social things. I mean, probably less so right now, but kind of in a traditional situation. If you know that you're somebody who has to be very precise about how you're allocating all of your time, I would argue that it's beneficial to you to design your project and its overall scale around that. It's incredibly important to have an awareness of what you want to get out of a game before you start working on it. And if it's something that you kind of want to put out there as your first project into the world to help to get that exposure, to help to learn those game design skills, you probably want something that's scaled down. You want something that you're not going to have to spend years and years on by yourself over against every other schedule item in your life and then get burnt out on.
Right.
So I got a little bit on a tangent there.
No,
but
I think that's good because one thing you outlined, and I like to underscore a little bit here, is in mentioning the scope, understanding that, but also understanding lifestyle and just life in general, right? And yes, we're currently in the middle of a pandemic. Some areas are struck by this harder than others. But the point being that, okay, so that changes a little bit. You might actually have a little bit more free time because there's less lifestyle stuff that is going on. But regardless of that as a whole, I think it's also important to identify too within the scope, as you detailed it, to in certain situations you're going to have to take or make rather sacrifices, or in thus doing so make more time. And in when you make sacrifices, and I'm not telling people to go out and say, okay, you're not going to talk to anybody, you're just going to lock yourself in a room and make your game, because that's not going to be conducive either. Because again, burnout, to simplify it. But you are going to have to make some sacrifices, and in some cases too, that may come down to your game development. And here's my approach for this too, which is why I think it's so important. When you're getting to that point, if you're making, let's say everything's normal, there's no restrictions in terms of social activities, and your lifestyle is great, right? Sometimes, going out with that friends, X number of times during the week, maybe you need to cut back on that, because that's time that could be dedicated to really towards your game, towards other goals or objectives that you have, and things like that. And then vice versa, if you're putting too much time. So it really comes down to like a work-life balance type situation, things which is also to be mindful of and played in. But accepting that, because I think what can happen too, and from a personal experience, without going into too much detail here, there's a point where I was, running Rengen, I had a full-time job, and I had a family. And what was happening was I cared so much about all three of these things, and I didn't come to the exception, or I didn't come to accepting that, or basically providing that good work-life balance between these three entities. And I was so passionate about all three of them that I felt like anytime I devoted a little bit more time to one of those, it was pulling me away, or tearing me away is probably the best way I could describe it, from something else. It was really painful, and ultimately it wasn't healthy. So that's where I'm kind of going on this tangent a little bit, is to be accepting of what you're allocating for those things. So as you said, Mustapha, when you're looking into the scope and really thinking about what you're applying, reallocating those resources, and in this case specifically, as it probably relates to a lot of you, coming down to time, planning it out, and kind of setting those expectations, hey, I'm going to do this. If you go over a little bit here and there, that's okay. It's more of a process than anything else, and then to monitor to that and move on. But you really want to do that, because if you don't, and if you don't give yourself that much flexibility, you can run into other issues too. So again, the level of scope you said, and also applying what those allocations are, and being flexible with it, I think is probably the best way you can go about it, as you described.
Yeah, and I would definitely, I appreciate that, and I would definitely double down and even say, as you're, considering those allocations, especially for game developers, knowing your project is also a really big part of this. It's hard in the early stages to know exactly what a project's always going to ask of you, but there are some things you really want to get a start on early. For instance, if you know that you're going to have to outsource anything, assets or otherwise, starting to kind of curate the people you have in mind, all of those things kind of prevent you from reaching a point where okay, now you're at a point where you can't really move forward in development without having access to these things, and you have to scramble to kind of